Nathaniel Cole thought he was offering a stranger nothing more than a summer job. "I can offer you work," he said, tipping his hat to the young woman standing on a boarding house porch after being turned away again. She looked at him for a long moment before quietly answering, "I'm not looking for work. I'm looking for a family." At that moment, neither of them knew that one simple conversation would save a ranch, heal two lonely hearts, and become the beginning of the family they had both believed was already lost. Miles City, Montana, in the summer of 1889, was a town built on cattle money and horse money, and it had opinions about women who arrived without either. Charlotte Vance Lottie, to the handful of people who'd known her long enough to shorten it, had walked the length of Main Street twice that morning, and twice she had been turned away. The Bellinger house was the third boarding house she tried. It sat 2 blocks off the rail depot, a clean clapboard building with a hand-painted sign, and a landlady named Ruth Bellinger, who looked Lottie over the way a buyer looks over a horse with a questionable leg. "I don't take in women traveling alone," Mrs. Bellinger said. "No offense meant, but I've got a reputation to keep, and a woman with no husband and no kin to vouch for her is a question I can't answer for my other guests." Lottie had heard some version of that sentence in 2 other houses already. She did not argue. Arguing had never once changed a landlady's mind, and she had learned that fact the hard way twice before 10 o'clock. "I understand," she said, and she meant it, which was its own kind of exhausting. She was 27 years old, and until March she had had a father, a house, and 300 acres of unproved claim land along the Tongue River that her father had worked for 11 years, without ever finishing the paperwork that would make it fully, unquestionably hers. Samuel Vance had died of a fever in the spring, quick the way fevers sometimes are, and left his daughter a debt, a half-built claim, and no one in the world she could call family. She stood on the Bellinger house porch a moment longer than she needed to, folding the rejection into the same place she'd folded the last 2, and that was where Nathaniel Cole found her. I had come into town to hire help for the summer. His ranch was short, 2 hands, and the roundup was 6 weeks off, and he had stopped outside the Bellinger house because his horse needed water at the trough out front. He was not a man who inserted himself into other people's business, but he had heard the tail end of the conversation through the open window, and something about the flatness in the young woman's voice as she said, "I understand," stayed with him longer than it should have. "Ma'am." He took off his hat before she'd even turned around. "I couldn't help but overhear. I've got a ranch outside town short-handed for the season. I can offer you work if you're looking for it. Room included." Lottie looked at him the way she'd learned to look at every offer that summer for the catch. First, the kindness, second. He was perhaps 33, sun-worn in the ordinary way of ranchers, with the kind of stillness that comes from a man used to working alone. He did not look away when she studied him. That, at least, was something. "I appreciate it," she said, "but I'm not looking for work." He waited. He had the look of a man who knew how to wait. "I'm looking for a family," she said. She had not meant to say it, that plainly, not to a stranger on a boarding house porch. But it was the truest sentence she owned that summer, and once it was out of her mouth, she found she didn't want to take it back. Nate turned his hat once in his hands. "That's a different kind of offer than I was making." "I know," she said. "It usually is." He didn't laugh, and he didn't step back the way the men in the mercantile had when she'd tried to explain her situation to the loan clerk 2 days before. He simply nodded slow, like a man recalculating a fence line he'd misjudged. Miles City that morning smelled of dust and rail smoke, wagons rattling toward the stockyards on the east end of town, and somewhere behind them a dog barked twice and went quiet. Lottie was aware in the particular way a person becomes aware of everything when they're deciding whether to trust a stranger of how ordinary the street looked for a conversation that might decide the next 6 months of her life. "You want to explain that to me over coffee?" he said. Or would you rather I go back to minding my own business? Lottie looked at him for a long moment. The porch boards were warm under her feet. Down the street, a freight wagon rattled past, and somewhere behind her, Ruth Bellinger's curtain twitched, the landlady, watching the exchange with open curiosity now that the transaction had gotten more interesting than she'd expected. Coffee, Lottie said, would be a start. They walked to a small dining hall 2 doors down, and Lottie carried with her folded twice in her jacket pocket the one document she had not shown anyone in town yet. The claim paper her father had never finished filing, its edges gone soft from being taken out and put away so many times. She did not take it out yet. She wanted to see first whether this stranger with the tired eyes and the patient hat-turning would still be sitting across from her once he understood what family actually meant to a woman in her position. He ordered 2 coffees without asking what she wanted, and that too she filed away. "All right," he said once the cups were poured. "Tell me what kind of family you're looking for." She did. The claim paper came out of Lottie's pocket slower than anything else she owned. She smoothed it flat on the dining hall table, and Nate noticed she did it with both hands, the way a person handles something they are afraid of tearing further than it's already torn. "My father filed on 300 acres along the tongue in '78, she said. "Good water, good grass. He never finished proving it up. There was always another season, another reason to wait. He died in March before he got to it." "And the claim passes to you," Nate said. "It's supposed to." She turned the paper so he could read the clerk's notation along the bottom edge. "Under the land office rules, an unproved claim inherited by an unmarried woman without kin in the county has to show a settled household within 6 months or it reverts, gets reopened for filing." She paused. "There's a man in town who's already told the clerk he intends to file the moment it does." Nate read the line twice before he looked up. Ezra Whitfield. Something in the way he said the name told her he already knew the man or knew of him, and neither one boded particularly well. "You know him. Everybody in Custer County knows him," Nate said. "He loaned my neighbor money 2 winters back and took the man's north pasture when the loan came due a season early. Legal every step of it. That's the trouble with Whitfield, he never breaks a rule. He just writes the rules tight enough that you break yourself trying to keep up." Lottie set the paper down, flatter as if pressing it might keep it from being taken from her by force of will alone. "He loaned my father $400 last winter for breeding stock. My father died still owing most of it. Whitfield's held the note since, and he's made it plain to the bank that he doesn't expect the daughter of a dead man to make good on a dead man's debt, not without something to secure it." She looked up. "The something is the claim." "So he's patient," Nate said. "He's waiting for the 6 months to run out, and then he files, and the debt and the land both come to him at once. That's the shape of it." Nate sat back in his chair and turned the coffee cup a quarter turn without drinking from it, the way a man does when he's thinking through a problem that isn't fully his yet, but is starting to feel like it might become one. "You said you're looking for a family. You mean you need to show the land office a household, a husband on the record?" "I mean I need to survive the next 6 months without losing the only thing my father left me," Lottie said. "A husband on the record is the fastest way the law recognizes. I'm not going to pretend it's more complicated than that or less." "You've asked other men." It wasn't quite a question, but she answered it as one. 2. One wanted the land more than he wanted anything resembling honesty about wanting it. The other laughed, which at least had the virtue of being quick. She met his eyes. "I'm telling you plainly what this is, Mr. Cole, because you were plain with me on that porch. I'd rather you know the whole shape of the thing before you decide anything, including whether you still want to buy me coffee." Nate was quiet long enough that she began folding the paper back along its worn creases. She'd overplayed her hand by being honest too early. That was a mistake she'd make once and correct for the rest of her life, she told herself, watching him not answer. I wasn't going to hire a hand today anyway, he said finally. I was going to hire someone who'd leave in October when the season ended. That's not a household. That's a wage. No, she agreed. It isn't. I've got a ranch that's had 2 people living on it for 3 years and doing the work of 6, he said. One of them's me. He didn't explain who the other might have been, not yet. And Lottie noticed the sentence stop exactly where it stopped, like a fence that had been built and then abandoned mid-post. You don't have to decide today, she said, giving him the same courtesy he'd given her on the porch space to not answer. No, he agreed. But I'd like to see the rest of that paperwork before I do. The note, Whitfield's holding the claim, filing whatever else you've got folded up in that pocket. He said it without a trace of doubt about her honesty, only the plain practicality of a man who intended to understand a thing fully before he put his name anywhere near it. If I'm going to consider this, I want to know exactly what I'd be standing next to. Lottie had not expected that particular request, and it took her a moment to answer, because it was in its own quiet way the first sign she'd had all summer that someone intended to look at her situation clearly, instead of either exploiting it or fleeing from it. I can bring the rest out to your ranch tomorrow, she said. If you'll have me. I believe I will, Nate said, and for the first time since she'd sat down, something in his face loosened, just slightly, like a knot, given an inch of slack. Cottonwood Bend Ranch sat 4 miles north of town, along a bend in the creek lined with the cottonwoods that gave it its name, and Lottie saw within the first 10 minutes of arriving that it was a place being kept alive by exactly one pair of hands stretched too thin. The horse barn was solid, well-tended. The animals fed on schedule and groomed with more care than most ranch stock received. The house, by contrast, told a different story. The bunkhouse beside the barn was clearly lived in boots by the door, a coffee pot always on the stove, while the main house, larger and better built, sat with its front room's shuttered curtains drawn against a sun that no longer seemed welcome inside. Nate met her at the gate and took her horse without being asked, and led her not to the closed house but to the bunkhouse table where he'd laid out bread, cold beef, and a second-place setting he must have put out before she arrived. You cook, she said, surprised into saying it. I eat, he corrected. Cooking's a generous word for it. He set a second cup down across from his own, and Lottie noticed, because she had trained herself this past year, to notice which small gestures cost a person something and which cost nothing at all, that the second cup did not match the first. It had clearly not been used in some time. She spread the rest of her father's papers across the table. The promissory note bearing Samuel Vance's signature shaky in its last month. The claim filing with the county clerk's stamp. A letter from the bank confirming the 6-month clause. Nate read each one slowly, in order the way she'd noticed him read the first paper the day before, fully, without skipping to the bottom for the conclusion. $400, he said when he reached the note. At Whitfield's interest, that's climbing fast. I know what it's climbing to, Lottie said. I've done the arithmetic more times than I'd like to admit. He set the papers down, squared their edges without needing to, and looked at her directly. I'll do it, he said. I'll marry you, put my name next to yours on the claim stand as your household of record. In return, I'd want the work to be real, not a favor and arrangement. You'd have a home here, a share of what the ranch earns, and my name where the land office needs it. You don't know me, Lottie said, echoing without meaning, to a sentence she suspected every person in her position had said to every person in his. No, Nate said. But I know you didn't flinch when I asked to see the note. And you didn't dress this up as something prettier than it is when you could have. He paused. That's more than I got from the last conversation I had in this kitchen, and that one mattered to me a good deal. Something in the way he said it told her there was a story behind the sentence, but she didn't reach for it yet. Some doors she was learning about this man already opened only when he chose to open them. Why, she asked instead, would you take this on, a stranger's debt, a stranger's land dispute, a marriage that starts as paperwork? You could hire help for the season and never think of Ezra Whitfield again. Nate looked toward the window, toward the shuttered front rooms of the house he no longer used. This ranch has been doing the work of 6 with one pair of hands for 3 years, he said. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine. He looked back at her. I'm not going to pretend I've got some grand answer for you today. I've got a house with rooms nobody's opened in 3 years, and a claim of my own I know how to hold on to, and you've got a fight coming that I understand better than most men in this county would. That's reason enough to start. It wasn't a declaration, and Lottie was glad of that. She had no room in her life that summer for declarations only, for people who did what they said they'd do. But it was, she thought, watching him fold the papers back into a neat stack and hand them to her rather than keep them an answer, built out of something sturdier than sentiment. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. Neither of them wrote the terms down. They didn't need to. The papers on the table were terms enough, $400 and 6 months, and a name that had to go beside hers before the county clock ran out. But there was a second cup on that table now that hadn't been used in 3 years, and neither of them mentioned that either, though both of them noticed. Outside, the evening had gone the deep gold color, particular to Montana summers, the cottonwoods along the creek turning silver-backed in the wind. Lottie gathered her father's papers and squared them against the table edge, the same careful motion she used on everything she meant to keep whole. Nate walked her out to where she'd tied her horse, and neither of them spoke much on the way, the quiet between them already settling into something less like strangers and more like two people who had just agreed to build something they couldn't yet fully picture. Thursday, he said as she mounted. I'll ride into town and we'll see Pruitt about making it official. Thursday. She agreed and rode back toward the Bellinger house with the papers safe in her jacket, lighter than she'd felt in months. They were married on a Thursday morning at the Custer County Land Office, not the church, because Nate said plainly that the marriage needed to exist on the county record before it existed anywhere else, and Lottie had not argued with the logic of that, even though some small part of her had imagined once long before this year that a wedding might look different. The clerk, a thin, careful man named Elias Pruitt, performed double duty as witness and notary, and a drummer passing through town on business served as the second witness because Mrs. Bellinger, invited, had declined with a tight smile that suggested she still hadn't fully decided what to make of the arrangement. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Pruitt stamped the marriage record, and in the same visit notated Lottie's claim file to reflect a married household, and it was this second stamp, Lottie noticed, that made Nate exhale in a way the first one hadn't. That's the one that matters to Whitfield, he said once they were back outside in the July sun. I know, she said. Thank you. Cattle records tonight, he said, which was not the response she expected to a thank you, and she looked at him sideways, surprised into something close to a laugh. That's your answer to gratitude. My answer to gratitude is I'd like to know exactly what we're running before Whitfield or anyone else asks me a question about this ranch I can't answer, he said. The rest can wait. She found walking back to the wagon beside him that she didn't mind the rest waiting. There was a kind of comfort in a man who led with the work rather than the sentiment. Sentiment, in her experience, was cheap and often didn't survive its first hard winter, while work done consistently tended to tell the truth about a person faster than words could. What she did notice on the ride back through Miles City was Ezra Whitfield standing outside his own trading company office, watching their wagon pass with the particular stillness of a man recalculating. He did not wave. He did not step forward. He simply watched, and Nate kept his eyes on the road, and Lottie understood, without being told, that this was the first move in a longer game, not the last. They reached Cottonwood Bend in the late afternoon, and Nate, without announcement, walked to the main house and opened the front door for the first time since Lottie had arrived at the ranch. The hinges complained. Dust hung visible in the shaft of light that fell across the front room floor. "This is the house," he said. "I've been living in the bunkhouse since—" He stopped. "I've been living in the bunkhouse a while. You should have the house. I'll move your things in tomorrow." "You built this room shut," Lottie said gently, reading the dust, the drawn curtains, the particular stillness of a space that had been deliberately closed rather than simply neglected. "You don't have to open it all at once for my sake." "I know," Nate said. He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask him to, not yet. But she noted filing it beside the second coffee cup, and the sentence he'd stopped mid-thought in the kitchen, that there was a room in this house with a story in it, and that the story mattered enough to him that he'd rather not tell it before he was ready. "I'll take the room at the end," she said, instead. Practical, giving him the same grace he'd given her on the boarding house porch 3 days before. "Whichever one gets morning light. I like to be up early." Something in his shoulders came down half an inch. "That'd be the east room," he said. "It gets the most light in the county, my mother used to say." "Your mother lived here, built the house," Nate said. "Long before my time." He held the door for her, and she stepped past him into a house that smelled of dust and cedar and years of careful absence, and understood that she had just married a man with at least 2 ghosts she hadn't met yet, his mother's and whoever else had made that second coffee cup necessary in the first place. That first night, Lottie unpacked her few belongings into the east room, slowly listening to the unfamiliar creak of an unfamiliar house settling around her. Down the hall, she could hear Nate moving through the front rooms, opening one shutter, and then after a long pause, choosing not to open the next. She didn't call out to ask why. She had learned enough about this man in 4 days to know that some doors he would open in his own time at his own pace, and that rushing him toward any of them would cost more than it gained. She fell asleep to the sound of the creak outside her window, and woke before dawn out of old habit to find Nate already in the kitchen, coffee made 2 cups set out on the table without either of them needing to discuss whose name went where. The horse's name was Junebug, and by the end of Lottie's first week at Cottonwood Bend, she had learned that the mare was the one animal on the property Nate had not managed to fully gentle despite 3 years of patient work. "She was my—" Nate started one morning at the corral fence, and then corrected course the way Lottie had noticed he often did when a sentence threatened to walk somewhere he wasn't ready to go. "She came from a bad situation for I bought her. Spooks at sudden movement won't take a saddle from a man standing square in front of her. I've gentled worse. This one's taken longer than most." Lottie watched Junebug pace the far corner of the corral, ears pinned, and recognized something in the mare's posture that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with people who had been handled roughly enough once that gentleness itself now read as a threat to prepare against. "May I try," she said, "before you saddle her today?" Nate studied her a moment, not doubt exactly more. The look of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew about the woman he'd married 5 days earlier. "Go ahead," he said. "She hasn't hurt anybody. She just won't let anybody close." Lottie climbed through the corral rail slowly, and instead of walking toward Junebug directly, she turned her shoulder to the mare and stood at an angle looking somewhere else entirely, the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old on a ranch 3 states from here. "My father broke horses for the army before he broke land for himself," she said, half to Nate, half to the mare, keeping her voice low and even. "He used to say a horse doesn't trust a face coming straight at it. Trusts a shoulder. Trusts somebody willing to wait." She stood in the corral for the better part of 20 minutes, not approaching, simply existing at an angle patient, until Junebug's ears came up out of their pinned, wary flatness, and the mare took 3 steps closer entirely on her own. By the time Lottie had a hand on Junebug's neck, Nate was standing at the rail with his forearms crossed over the top board, watching in a silence that had nothing impatient in it. He did not call out advice. He did not step in. He simply watched a woman do something with more skill and more patience than he'd managed to summon in 3 years of trying. And something in his expression Lottie caught at once. Glancing back had shifted from the careful neutrality he'd worn all week into something closer to respect, plain and unguarded. "You didn't tell me you could do that," he said once she'd walked the mare in a slow circle and led her back toward the rail. "You didn't ask what I could do," Lottie said. "You asked what I needed." Those turned out to be different questions. "I'll remember to ask both from now on," Nate said, and there was something almost like humor in it, dry and quiet, the first she'd heard from him. That evening, over supper in the bunkhouse, she still hadn't moved her cooking into the main house kitchen, yet some transitions taking longer to make than others. Nate mentioned, without much ceremony, that he wanted her opinion on the fall breeding stock. "You're asking me," she said, "or you're being polite." "I don't generally do polite when it costs money," he said. "I'm asking because you clearly know more about handling stock than you let on over coffee 3 days ago, and I'd rather run this ranch with 2 people who know what they're doing than one person pretending he doesn't need help." Lottie set down her fork and looked at him for a moment, in the lamplight, recalibrating something of her own. She had married this man for a signature on a claim file. She had not expected in the same week to find herself sitting across a table from someone who asked her opinion and meant it. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about the stock." They talked past dark, which mares to breed back, which of the 2-year-olds showed promise, whether to sell the older gelding before winter feed costs made the decision for them. Lottie found herself sketching out a breeding schedule on the back of an old feed receipt, the way she used to do for her father before his hands got too unsteady to hold a pencil, steady himself, and Nate watched her fill the page with a kind of quiet attention that had nothing to do with the horses at all. "You miss this," he said, not quite a question. "I miss being useful for something I understand," Lottie said. "There's not much room for that when you're mostly just trying to survive a deadline." "There's room for it here," Nate said, and it was without either of them naming it as such the first evening since her father's funeral that had felt less like survival and more like something closer to a life. Ezra Whitfield came to Cottonwood Bend on a Tuesday in August, riding a horse too fine for a man who claimed to be simply passing by, and Lottie knew before he'd dismounted that this was not a social call. How was a compact man, precisely dressed, even for ranch country, with the kind of smile that never quite reached past his teeth. "Mrs. Cole," he said, testing the name the way a man tests a coin for its weight. "Word travels fast in this county. I understand congratulations are in order, Mr. Whitfield." Lottie kept her voice even, the ledger of her father's debt already rising in her mind the moment his name left his mouth. "What brings you out this way?" "Business mostly." He produced from his breast pocket a folded copy of the promissory note, her father's note, $400 and climbing, and set it on the porch rail between them without being invited to. "I wanted to be neighborly and let you know the note comes due for its next interest payment at the end of the month. I'd hate for there to be any confusion about the terms given the recent change in your household." "There's no confusion," Lottie said. "The payment will be made." "Of course." Whitfield's smile didn't move. "Though I confess, a marriage arranged this quickly does raise a question or two at the land office. They do like to see these things are entered into in good faith, not simply as a convenience against a filing deadline." He let that sit a moment, watching her face for a reaction. She was careful not to give him. "I'm sure it's nothing that concerns you. I only mention it because I'd rather you hear it from a neighbor than a stranger. Nate came around the corner of the barn at that point, having heard the horse arrive, and Lottie felt him take up a position beside her on the porch, rather than in front of her. Close enough that Whitfield could see plainly. They stood together, but far enough back that the answer when it came would clearly be hers to give. "Mr. Whitfield," Nate said an even nod, nothing more. "Mr. Cole, I was just explaining to your wife that the note comes due for interest at month's end." "She heard you the first time," Nate said. "She generally does." Whitfield's eyes moved between them, weighing something, and Lottie understood in that moment precisely what Nate had done by staying half a step back. He had given Whitfield nothing to push against, no protective husband to bait into an argument that might read badly at a hearing, no evidence to carry back to town, that the marriage was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be, two people running a household together. "The payment will be made on schedule," Lottie said again, steady. "You'll have it by the last day of the month, same as the note requires. If you've got concerns about the household, Mr. Whitfield, you're welcome to raise them with the land office directly. I imagine Mr. Pruitt keeps thorough records." Something flickered behind Whitfield's practiced smile. Not quite surprise, but close to it, the look of a man who'd expected an easier target, and found instead a woman who knew exactly how much rope he had to work with, and had no intention of handing him more. "I'm sure it won't come to that," he said, retrieving the note and tucking it back into his coat. "Good day, Mrs. Cole. Mr. Cole." He mounted his fine horse and rode back toward town at an unhurried pace that felt to Lottie more like a threat than any words he might have said outright. Once he was well down the road, Nate let out a breath he'd apparently been holding since he rounded the barn. "He's going to try the land office," he said. "Question the marriage's good faith. That's the play." "I know," Lottie said. "You handled him better than I would have." "You didn't handle him at all," Lottie said, glancing at him. "You stood there and let me." "That was the point," Nate said simply. "It's your fight before it's mine. I'll stand next to you in it every time Whitfield shows his face on this property. But I'm not going to take the answer out of your mouth, not for him and not for anybody else." Lottie looked at the dust still settling on the road, where Whitfield's horse had passed, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Some old brace she'd been carrying since March easing by a fraction. It was not relief, exactly. It was closer to the feeling of a weight being shared rather than simply witnessed. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she had at the land office. "Don't thank me yet," Nate said. "He's not done. Men like Whitfield never make their real move on the first visit." How was right, though, neither of them yet knew how right or how soon. That evening, Lottie sat at the kitchen table long after supper, going over her father's note line by line, calculating exactly how much of the debt she could pay down before the month's end, without leaving the ranch short for winter feed. Nate found her still there past 10 o'clock and didn't tell her to stop. He simply set a second lamp beside her elbow so she could see the figures better, and went back to his own work at the other end of the table without a word. It happened by accident, the way most important discoveries in a shared house tend to happen. Lottie was carrying a basket of mending down the hallway of the main house in September, when a gust from an open window caught a door she'd always found latched, and it swung wide before she could stop it. The room was small, north-facing, and unmistakably meant for a child. A wooden cradle sat beneath the window, hand-built, the joints fitted with the kind of care a man puts into something he expects to matter for a long time. A folded blanket lay across its rail, small enough to fit no one older than a few months. And though 3 years of dust had settled over every other surface in the room, the blanket itself looked recently touched, as if someone came in from time to time simply to fold it again. Lottie did not go further into the room. She stood in the doorway, the basket of mending still in her arms, and understood without needing to be told what she was looking at. Nate found her there 20 minutes later, having come up from the barn, when he noticed her absent from the kitchen. At an hour, she was reliably present. He stopped in the hallway when he saw the open door, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "I should have latched that better," he said finally. "I didn't mean to open it," Lottie said. "The wind did that. I'm sorry, Nate." He came and stood beside her in the doorway, looking into the room, the way a man looks at something he has spent 3 years successfully not looking at. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "My wife. We built this room the winter she was carrying, finished the cradle myself that spring." He paused, and Lottie recognized the pause the same kind he'd used in the kitchen, the day they'd agreed to marry, the sentence approaching a place he wasn't sure he could walk into. "You don't have to," she started. "I want to," Nate said, which surprised her enough that she stayed quiet and let him find the rest of it in his own time. She went into labor early in the spring 3 years back. The doctor was 2 hours out by the time we got word to him. Both of them, Sarah and the boy, didn't survive the night. He looked at the cradle rather than at Lottie, his voice level in the particular way of a man who has told himself this story so many times in solitude that he can recite it now without breaking, though the cost of that levelness was written plainly enough in his shoulders. "I closed the house up that summer. Couldn't manage it any other way. Moved into the bunkhouse and told myself it was practical, closer to the stock." He shook his head slightly. "It wasn't practical. It was just easier than walking past this door every day." Lottie set the basket down on the hallway floor, and instead of offering him the kind of comfort she suspected the whole town had already tried and failed, to give him the soft, well-meant words that circle a wound without ever quite landing on it, she simply sat down on the bench beneath the hall window, and after a moment, Nate sat beside her. They didn't speak for a while. The house settled around them the way old houses do, and somewhere outside Junebug called out once from the corral, and eventually Lottie reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee. Not gripping, not urgent, simply present, the first deliberate touch either of them had allowed since the 11 minutes at the land office. "I'm not asking you to open this room for me," she said quietly. "I've got no claim on it, and I wouldn't want one. I just didn't want you sitting with this alone now that I know it's here." Nate turned his hand under hers, palm up, and held it, and it was, Lottie thought, the first time since she'd arrived at Cottonwood Bend that the arrangement between them had stopped feeling like two people sharing a legal convenience and started feeling like something considerably harder to name. "I haven't told anyone that," he said. "Not the whole of it. Not since it happened." "I know," Lottie said. "You don't have to tell it again unless you want to." They sat together until the light, through the hall window, shifted amber. And when they finally rose, Nate closed the door to the small, north-facing room himself, gently, the way a person closes a door. They intend to open again someday on their own terms when they're ready, not the way a person seals something away for good. Later that week, Lottie found herself standing in the doorway of that room again, alone this time, studying the cradle without touching it. She thought of her own mother, gone since childhood, and of her father's face the day he'd told her there'd be no brothers or sisters coming after all. Grief, she was learning, didn't always announce itself the same way twice. Sometimes it built a room and closed the door. Sometimes it folded a claim paper until the creases went soft. Either way, it asked the same question of the person carrying it, whether they intended to keep carrying it alone. She latched the door softly on her way out, and left it slightly less locked than she'd found it. The Tongue River Grange Hall held its late summer social on the first Saturday of September, and Lottie had not particularly wanted to attend, but Nate had pointed out gently and without pressure that appearing together in public mattered more now than it had a month before. "Whitfield's been talking," he said, while she pinned her hair before the mirror in the East Room. "Not directly," through Bellinger, through the bank clerk, planting the idea that this marriage was arranged too fast to be real. If we stay home every time there's a gathering, it feeds the story instead of answering it. I know, Lottie said. I'm not afraid of the hall, Nate. I'm just tired of being a subject people discuss instead of a person they speak to. That, Nate said, I understand better than most. The hall was warm with lamplight and crowded with families. Lottie mostly didn't know, and for the first hour, the evening passed without incident. Introductions, a plate of food. Nate's quiet hand at the small of her back when he steered her toward people worth knowing and away from ones who weren't. It was Martha Pruitt, the land office clerk's wife, who said the thing everyone else had apparently only been thinking. It's a fast arrangement. Martha said, not quite to Lottie's face, but not quite behind her back either, pitched for a small circle of women near the refreshment table to hear. A woman shows up in town with a claim about to lapse, and a month later there's a ring on her finger. Convenient, some might say. The circle went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it's waiting to see whether someone will flinch. Lottie set her teacup down on its saucer without a tremor, a small detail she was aware of only because she had trained herself over the hardest months of that year to notice when her hands betrayed her and when they didn't. Tonight, they didn't. It was fast, she agreed evenly. My father died in March, and Ezra Whitfield made it clear he intended to have my land the day my 6 months ran out. I won't pretend the timing wasn't practical, but I'd ask you this, is a marriage less real because the reason for it was plain instead of pretty? My mother married my father because he had good land and steady hands, and 40 years on, nobody in her church called that a lesser kind of love. I don't expect this town to understand my situation before it's willing to. I only ask that it not pretend cruelty is the same thing as concern. Martha's mouth opened and then closed again, clearly having expected either an apology or an argument and gotten neither. Nate, who had been in conversation a few feet away, arrived at Lottie's side in that moment, not rushing, not dramatic, simply present the way he'd been present at the porch rail with Whitfield in August. He did not speak for her. He did not repeat what she'd already said more forcefully, the way a lesser man might, eager to prove his loyalty by drowning out his wife's own voice. He simply stood beside her close enough that his presence was its own quiet statement, and said only, "My wife answers for herself in this house and every house. I'd think most of the folks here know that by now." It was not a defense so much as a fact delivered plainly, and it landed harder in the room than any raised voice would have. The circle around the refreshment table dispersed shortly after conversation, moving on to safer ground, and Martha Pruitt did not raise the subject again that evening, though Lottie noticed the woman watching them for the rest of the night with an expression that had shifted from certainty to something closer to reconsideration. Walking back to the wagon later, under a sky gone fully dark, Lottie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since Martha's first sentence. "You didn't say anything," she said. "In there. I half expected you to." "You didn't need me to," Nate said. "You said it better than I would have, and it needed to come from you, not from a husband defending his property." He helped her up into the wagon seat, his hand steady under hers. "I'll stand beside you at every one of these as long as you'll have me. I won't ever stand in front of you. That's not the kind of protecting I believe in." Lottie looked at him in the dim light and understood that this, more than the wedding, more than the claim filing, more than anything Pruitt had stamped that summer, was the moment the arrangement between them had quietly become something else. The ride home passed mostly in comfortable silence, the wagon wheels finding their familiar ruts in the road, the last of the Grange Hall's lamplight fading behind them. Lottie found herself thinking, not for the first time that month, that she had come to this county looking for a signature, and had somehow ended up with a great deal more than that. though she wasn't yet ready to say the word for it out loud, not even to herself. The notice arrived by county courier on the second Tuesday of October, a single sheet with a red wax seal, and Lottie read it twice at the kitchen table before she trusted herself to say the words out loud. "Whitfield's filed a formal challenge," she said. "Claims the marriage was entered in bad faith solely to defeat the 6-month clause. There's a hearing set for the 24th before the county land commissioner. If he can show the marriage isn't genuine, the claim reverts, and he's already got a filing ready to submit the same day." Nate took the notice from her and read it himself slower, the way he read everything, and set it down with the same careful precision he'd used on her father's promissory note back in July. "Then we go to the hearing," he said, "and we tell the truth. The whole of it plainly the way you told Martha Pruitt at the Grange Hall." Lottie folded her hands on the table, steadying something in herself, before she spoke again. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, "about the debt." Nate waited the way he always waited, giving her the room to say it in her own time. "I've been paying down Whitfield's note faster than the schedule requires," she said. "Every month more than the minimum. I didn't want to ask you before doing it. It felt like something I needed to manage myself, proof to myself, as much as to him, that I could carry my own weight in this arrangement. Not just bring a problem to your door and let you solve it for me." "I know," Nate said quietly. "I've seen the ledger. I wasn't going to say anything until you did." Lottie looked up, surprised. "I've been doing the same," he admitted. "Not from the ranch account, from what I've held back from my own wages this summer. The ones I never told you I was still drawing from the horse sales. I didn't want Whitfield to have any note left to waive at that hearing at all if I could help it. Between the two of us, we've cut what he's owed by more than half since August." He allowed himself something close to a rueful smile. "Seems we've both been quietly doing the same thing, neither one telling the other." "We should have told each other," Lottie said, though there was no real reproach in it, only the particular fondness of two careful people, recognizing their own caution, mirrored back at them. "We're telling each other now," Nate said. "That'll have to do." They spent the 2 weeks before the hearing preparing in earnest, gathering the payment receipts, a statement from Mr. Pruitt, confirming the marriage record, and the timely filing, even a brief gruff letter from Ruth Bellinger at the boarding house stating for the record that she'd witnessed the couple's courtship correspondence and found nothing false in it, a small kindness Lottie hadn't expected from a woman who'd turned her away from a room back in June. The night before the hearing, Nate found Lottie at the kitchen table once more, the same table where they'd first spread her father's papers in July, and set down beside her a single sheet of his own. A brief statement he'd written out in his own hand to read before the commissioner if it came to that. "I want you to see this before tomorrow," he said. "I want you going in there knowing exactly what I intend to say, so nothing surprises you in that room." Lottie read it slowly. It was not long. It did not dwell on the claim or the debt or the 6-month clause. It spoke instead of a woman who had not flinched when handed the worst month of her life, who had gentled a horse he'd failed for 3 years, who had answered Ezra Whitfield on her own porch without once needing rescue, and who had, without either of them planning it, made a house that had been closed for 3 years feel, for the first time since Sarah died, like somewhere he wanted to come home to. "Nate," she said, when she finished reading, and found she didn't have anything else ready to follow his name. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I just wanted you to know what I meant to say before I said it, in front of a commissioner instead of just you. Tomorrow would decide the land." Tonight, at that same worn table, Lottie understood that something considerably larger than the land had already been decided quietly over the better part of 4 months by 2 people too careful to announce it before they were sure. She banked the fire before bed, the way she'd done every night since September, and paused a moment at the hallway window, looking out at the horse barn silvered under a thin October moon. Whatever the commissioner decided in the morning, she thought she would still wake up in this house beside this man And for the first time since March, that fact alone felt like enough ground to stand on. The Custer County Land Commissioner's office was smaller than Lottie had imagined, a single room above the county courthouse, with a window that let in more dust than light, and Ezra Whitfield arrived precisely on time, dressed as though the outcome were already settled in his favor. Haimad his case first, methodical and unhurried, the timeline of the marriage filed within weeks of the claim's deadline. The debt still outstanding in part. The suggestion delivered without ever quite stating it outright, that convenience and love rarely arrived on the same calendar by coincidence. "I don't dispute that the marriage is legally recorded," Whitfield said, addressing the commissioner rather than the two people seated across the room. "I dispute that it was entered into in good faith as the statute requires rather than as a transparent maneuver to defeat a legitimate creditor's claim." The commissioner, a deliberate man named Harmon Voss, turned to Lottie and Nate. "Mrs. Cole, Mr. Cole, you may respond." Lottie stood first, as they'd agreed the night before, and spoke plainly about her father, the note, the 6 months, the 2 men before Nate, who had answered her honesty with mockery or an unacceptable price. She did not dress the arrangement up as more romantic than its beginning had been. "I won't stand here and tell you I fell in love with Nathaniel Cole on the porch of a boarding house," she said. "That would be a lie, and I've told this commission nothing but the truth so far. What I will tell you is what's happened in the 4 months since, and I'd ask that you weigh that against whatever Mr. Whitfield believes he knows about how marriages are supposed to begin." She sat down. Nate rose. He did not read from the paper he'd written in the end. He'd left it folded in his coat pocket and spoke instead, the way Lottie had come to know he spoke best, plainly, saying only exactly as much as was true. "I buried a wife and a son on this land 3 years ago," he said, "and I closed half my house rather than walk past the room we'd built for him. I want the commission to understand that before anything else because it matters to what I'm about to say next." He paused, and the room, Whitfield included, went very still. "Charlotte Vance came into my life needing a household of record, and nothing more than that. And I offered it to her because it was the decent thing to do, and because Ezra Whitfield does not get to decide what a family owes each other simply because he holds a note." He looked briefly toward Lottie, and something passed between them that needed no further words. "This is my family," he said. 6 words, Commissioner. That's the whole of my case." Commissioner Voss studied the papers before him for a long moment. The marriage record, the payment ledger, Mr. Pruitt's statement, Ruth Bellinger's brief letter, and looked up at Ezra Whitfield with the weariness of a man who had seen this exact maneuver attempted before. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I find no evidence of bad faith here. Quite the contrary. The challenge is denied. The claim stands in the names of Charlotte and Nathaniel Cole, jointly as filed." He set down his pen. "I'd also note for the record that the note in question appears to be nearly satisfied ahead of its original schedule. I trust that will conclude the matter between you and this household, Mr. Whitfield, in every remaining respect." Whitfield gathered his papers without a word, his composure intact, but his purpose plainly spent, and left the room without meeting either of their eyes again. They rode back to Cottonwood Bend in the last hour of daylight, saying little the way two people do when the thing they've been bracing against for months has finally released its grip. The ranch came into view at dusk, and Lottie noticed, before they'd even reached the gate, a light on in the east-facing window of the main house. The small north room, its door standing open. A new curtain she'd sewn the week before hung at last against the glass. "You didn't tell me you were going to open it today," Nate said, following her gaze. "I didn't decide until this morning," Lottie said. "I thought whatever happened at that hearing, I wanted to come home to a house that wasn't waiting to be closed again." They didn't celebrate that night with any grand gesture. There was no toast, no speech, to match the one Nate had given the commissioner. They simply made supper together in the kitchen, the way they had most evenings since August. And when it was done, Nate crossed the small distance between the stove and the table and put his arms around her, something slower than a performance, something that had been building for months and had only now found an evening quiet enough to arrive in. A family isn't the paper, Lottie said, her head against his shoulder, the ledger closed on the table beside them for the first time in months, without a debt left to track inside it. It's staying after the paper stops being the reason. Then I suppose, Nate said, we're a family. Outside, the October, dark settled over Cottonwood Bend, over the horse barn, and the mended east fence and the small north room with its new curtain lit gold against the night. And inside the coffee was on, and the second cup that had once gathered dust in a cupboard for 3 years had a permanent place at the table now, and it was by every measure that mattered to either of them exactly right.
Charlotte Vance walked into my city that summer with nothing but a folded blank paper and a promise to a father she just buried, and she asked a stranger for the one thing the law would actually let her keep, a family plainly named, honestly built. Nathaniel Cole had spent 3 years believing he would close the door on ever helping once again, until a woman who refused to disappear quietly into something else paperwork told him that a family isn't the moment to people sign record. It's every ordinary evening after, when neither one of them bleeds. I would love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Rub your city and stay in the comments. I read every one, and it's become one of my favorite parts of putting these stories together. If Lottie and Nat found a place in your evening, I would be grateful if you hit like and subscribe before you go. It's a small thing that helps this channel keep finding the people who need a story like this one. There's another trash ranch, another town, another two people figuring out what family means. Waiting for you soon. Until then, take care of yourself and thank you for riding along with me tonight.